hate to be super typical, but I would say the world of Bridgerton has really encapsulated me at the moment. There's just something so beautiful about the escapism and the characters and the visual elements. It's like all encompassing. It's so hard not to get like wrapped up in it. And I just adore it so much. So I have to say that because it kind of ended part one like neatly wrapped up in a bow, and I love that. But now they're unraveling the bow, they're starting part two, and you've got what, like 3 4 episodes until you get a conclusion again. And I'm like, I have to be in the right headspace. I have to kind of watch them all and binge it so that I can get to that conclusion moment and I can get on with my life. Otherwise I'm going to be up at night wondering what's going to happen, and I won't get my work done, I won't sleep. So I'm waiting for the right time, maybe this weekend.
We are such different people. Like that delayed gratification, like kind of way of living is like not me at all. Like I think I was like, okay, I worked out it comes out at 3 p.m. in WA. 4 p.m. I finished work. I think by 4:30 I'd already started watching the first episode and I watched it all before like the next day. There
Yeah,
was no part of me that was like, I cannot wait. So
that's fair.
welcome to Our Student Edge, where we're answering your questions about student life and life in general. So, Millie, thank you so much for joining us today. If you will, can you please introduce yourself, tell us a bit about you, and also about AllKND?
Yeah. So I went to uni and graduated in 2017. And then I went on to work for myself. It's been, a little while since then, and I've never actually worked for anyone else, which is, has its ups and its downs. And I started out building a personal brand because I was studying journalism and media. And then I was living abroad as well at the same time. I did an exchange program, which I highly recommend. It was one of the best things I ever did for myself, and my personal growth and my career as well. It was kind of the start of the hashtag therapy is cool era where we really started to see social media bring up a lot of conversations around people's mental health. And it started with, the surface level stuff, kind of the Are You Okay Day vibes, bit about anxiety, and then we worked our way up from there, and I was really interested in that. It was like a really great opportunity for me to self-educate and then go back to my experiences in high school and in university when I was really struggling with depression and anxiety, and I was medicated and I still am. And what does that look like long term, and what does a therapist actually do for you, and kind of connecting the dots as well around like why was I such an anxious teen, and what brought me joy when I was that age versus what brings me joy now, and how have I grown, and just a general self-awareness. And so the more I dug, the more I figured out that mental health is such a complex issue, and we don't, at least when I was in school and uni, it's not something that you learn about really. It's not part of the curriculum. And yeah, you can go digging on social media and Google literally anything in the whole world, but it's more about like digging through that information and finding stuff that is A, evidence based, and B, a good fit for you. And it's very overwhelming. It seemed to be ongoing issue for young people who were supporting those closest to them, their best mates, and not knowing how to safely do that or how to effectively do that, and feeling really isolated from their family and friends, kind of struggling on alongside this person that they deeply cared about and wanted to keep safe, but didn't know how. And that's exactly what happened to me when I was 15. And so we kind of just decided then and there that there was a gap in the market in terms of peer-to-peer mental health first aid. So what do you do when you are the first responder to your friend who has some version of a mental health challenge that's unique to them, their suffering is unique to them? What do you actually say and do in those moments where it's beyond the "are you okay" conversation? It's, you know what, I actually do need help and I'm coming to you as someone that I trust. I don't want you to tell anyone about it. And you kind of go, oh, okay, I can Google it. Again, very overwhelming. But yeah, we just want to bridge that gap, and that's what we do now with ALLKND, which has kind of transitioned and is now alive and well as its own form of a charity. And that's what I do 9 to 5 every day. I run this charity as the founder and the managing director. And yeah, we have one thing and we do it well, and that's the peer-to-peer mental health first aid training, also known as Good Mate training. And then we exist on social media.
When I first found out about AllKND, I immediately was like, oh my gosh, this fills a gap in the market, because so often I think I'm also like an older, not so old Gen Z, if that makes sense. And I know when I was in school, like that was kind of when we first started talking about mental health. Like that was the first time I was aware that I had friends that saw psychologists that were medicated for mental health issues, and it was my first sort of exposure to that. And there's so much resources now, I feel like, out there for young people to sift through about mental health issues and about getting help. But so often they're not, that first person that they're going to speak to is their friend or is their mate. It's not going to be a clinical psychologist or someone who's trained in being able to help them out, right? And I think that's why we got so many questions about this from our members, just being like, how do I get, mental health help? How do I get, like, why am I so stressed? Like, how do I balance everything? And it's like, it's hard because those are really difficult conversations to have with, a mental health professional in the first place. But it's like, that's not even the first step. That's like the seventh step. Like, first you tend to talk to your mates, right? And I think we've all been there. Like, I'm sure it's like that for you as well. But like when I was a teenager and I first kind of really understood what mental health was, and your mate's like, I'm really struggling with this, you almost don't know what to say. And it's like, you don't want to say the wrong thing. You don't want to, give them the bad advice. You don't want to give them advice that someone else is then maybe giving them that's, contradictory. And it's like, where do we start?
We know that 2 in 5 young Australians are currently struggling with some version of a mental health challenge, which is a lot. If you think about, a group chat of 5 mates, almost half of them are going through something. So it's more common than we think. And then in terms of that kind of asking for support, it still doesn't really come that naturally to us. Perhaps because we are kind of the first generation to be so open about it, it still feels like a little bit tricky. And also just, as human beings, it's always going to be tricky to be vulnerable. It'll always be that way, just as the way that we're wired as human beings. And so I think a nice byproduct of Good Mate training, obviously the outcome is that you feel more confident in supporting a mate through varying levels of mental health crises. But the byproduct of that is learning about different mental health conditions, how bad they can get, what it might feel like for someone who's going through it. And therefore you develop this compassion on the side, because it's right there, it's black and white, it's clinical, it's evidence-based. We know these things to be true. And so you might start to think differently around, how mental health issues can present, how hard they might be for people around you going through them. And then also if you're going through something as well, it might help you to understand that it is far more common than you thought, and it can be incredibly, incredibly challenging. And so by you feeling, not so good or really struggling with something, having this information in the back of your mind that you've learnt in this training, maybe you'll be a bit kinder to yourself because you know more now, and it all kind of comes together in this digital community that we have, and the ripple effect can be really immense as well. Like if we have one good mate, in this group chat, that's, a bunch of people that they can then support, not just in their group chat, but in their household or their workplace or their sports team.
I want to know if you feel like this, because I kind of felt like this in school and in uni. I guess when I finally realized that, yeah, maybe I have got a bit of a mental health issue, I've got a bit of anxiety, however you want to define it. I really hated getting advice, like, and I'm sure other students get this as well, where it's like, well, are you getting 8 hours of sleep? Are you eating a healthy diet? Are you taking time to exercise? And it's like, I hated that because I was like, I barely have enough time to have a shower today. And you're wanting me to go out and exercise. Like the thought of having to leave my house, like, is already difficult enough. And I don't know, I just felt so discouraged when people gave me advice like that. Like I was like, this is not tangible and this is not like helpful to my life whatsoever. Was that something that you experienced as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, having adults around us who didn't necessarily grow up with the same chronic pressures that Gen Z face, there's a bit of an element of dismissal. And I think that comes from this kind of stereotype of Gen Z being overly emotional, overly sheltered and protected and cushioned. But we know for a fact that there are these chronic pressures and chronic stresses facing our generation like never before. Our brains are also wired differently from the way we grew up online, essentially. And so I think instead of, going straight to the solutions based conversation around, well, you didn't get enough sleep or you didn't go for a run or whatever it is. I think although those solutions, although they're not, solutions on their own, although those lifestyle factors can provide, some support in recovering from mental illness or a really rough period of mental health, I think firstly you need to have a conversation around validation, and just kind of talking through, what are your symptoms of this moment in time? Like, what's the cause of it? Maybe it is, academic pressure, say, for example, or is it something that is even more underlying than that? Is it, situational? Is it just academic pressure and exams coming up? Or perhaps it's something that's in your DNA, perhaps it's hereditary, or perhaps it's this ongoing level of mental ill health that, you may need to see a professional for. It's kind of tricky to, self-diagnose or for, adults in your circle to diagnose, of course. But I think there just needs to be first up just this kind of general convo around like what are you actually experiencing right now? What are you feeling? What's become really difficult for you? To answer your question, I think it can be incredibly frustrating because of that generational divide. I think there's this kind of acknowledgement that the adults around us currently potentially didn't grow up in the same way that we did, different brain chemistry, different pressures, and kind of just assume things about our generation without having that lived experience and jump straight to solutions or jump straight into kind of trying to relate it back to their own experiences, which is not super helpful because their experience is usually quite different from this generation's.
A bit of like, let's fix the issue at hand kind of vibe going on. And I'm kind of like, I definitely kind of look at it a bit now, looking in, and I can acknowledge that not every mental health issue is going to have a permanent fix or like a fix full stop. Sometimes these things are just ongoing. And I think when we look at it and we frame the argument as like, oh, well, you just need to get that fixed and sorted out and then you'll be right. Like, how does that make the person who's going to have ongoing mental health issues for the rest of their life feel? Because that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a thing that we've got to get through, right? But I don't know. I just feel like I hate that a little bit.
Definitely. And some of these symptoms that we're experiencing, such as I cannot bring myself to get out of bed, or I absolutely cannot get through a university lecture, like some of those things, as I said, might be related to some more kind of, I guess, tangible stuff, like the fact that we might be undiagnosed neurodivergent, for example. We might have different learning styles, and therefore the one that we're experiencing currently might not be a good fit, which is spurring on all of these different symptoms. Like, it's really just this ongoing exploration of trying to when you have the capacity. And I found that when I was kind of digging into my own experiences of mental ill health or mental health conditions, such as depression and anxiety, even, words like, or labels like overstimulation, like I didn't know what that was until, 5 years ago. And now I use it, every second day to try and explain to the people I'm with, the people I'm working, my partner, why I'm, on the verge of a panic attack. I can just say, apologies, I'm going to have to, take a step out. I'm feeling extremely overstimulated right now. Gotcha. Like that just helps with communication, and it allows you personally to not be so hard on yourself in saying like, well, what's wrong with you? And it's like, no, it's actually just a really common and simple, explanation for why I'm feeling like this. Other times, obviously, it's a little harder to label, and there's dangers in labeling and overdiagnosing and things like that. But I think bottom line, the more you know, the more compassionate you can be with yourself and with those around you experiencing different types of mental health conditions. I was going to ask because I've been out of uni for like, oh God, 7 years or something. What does the mental health, I guess, prevention space or even kind of support framework look like now, in your opinion?
Um, you know, that's really difficult for me to say because I think for me as a student, that was never really presented in front of me. Like, I feel like that's something I had to seek out. And even then, I found it really difficult to seek that help as a student because, like, I think in my head, I was like, well, I'm just stressed, right? I'm stressed because of uni. That's a given. I know that. But this has an end date, so I'll be fine.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how my mentality was. Like, I think we got like a few emails during COVID. I was a student during COVID, lucky me. And I got a few emails kind of being like, oh, if you need any help, like we've got on campus, like psychologists and therapists who can speak to over Zoom or over video or, whatever. And I was like, yeah, and like, I don't know, I'm very much the kind of person who's like, I can't deal with this right now. Like, there's too many things going on and something's got to give. And oftentimes for me, that's my mental health. Yeah, like, I think it's very much like the help is there if you want it, but or if you need it, but I'm kind of like I would have never approached. I would have never done that. Like for me,
Yeah.
like that was my last resort. Like
Yeah.
it's like okay, things have now gotten so bad that I can no longer cope and everything else has to give. That's when I'll seek that help. And I think a lot of people, Gen Zs, are like that because it's like we've got a million things that we're doing, right? Like you're trying to balance uni, trying to balance working, trying to balance paying rent, trying to balance hanging out with your mates.
Mm.
And oftentimes, I don't know, I feel like mental health is the thing that gives. So
Yeah.
personally, I never sought
Yeah.
out that help on
Mm.
campus.
Do you think it's like not publicly advertised to students enough, and they don't make it easy enough to get involved in that process? Or is it just something that you don't actually really want to engage in right now?
I think it's a mixture of both, right? I think fortunately there probably are some students on uni campuses who don't need that help. They might be like, you know what, I'm on it. I can do this, this, and this, and I'm perfectly okay. And like that's great that they're one of those 3 and 5 who are doing okay for that moment. I do think there's also a bit of like I don't know if it's unconscious, but maybe it's kind of this thing of like, well, uni is my stressor. I don't want to then seek help from what is my stressor, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
a bit of that going on.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I would have preferred to have seen someone outside of uni,
Mm.
if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, but also kind of like I didn't, it was very like not hush hush, but I feel like there's no access to it. Like
Yeah.
if I had seen like maybe a student ambassador talk about it or like my guild speak about it a little bit more, maybe I would have been more inclined to seek that help. But because
Yeah.
it was very much like from the uni to students, I was very much like, well, how much are they going to help me? And
Yeah.
then it's
Yeah.
a thing of when I'm no longer a student, is that help still going to be accessible?
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think it sounds like the dynamics just a bit kind of off which is really interesting, because we've tried to, in our early days, our first approach was to go straight to schools, like that makes sense, and universities, and go, okay, this is our, evidence-based, properly researched by the University of Queensland. This is our training program. We're obviously in our early days, but it's free. We'd love for, a bulk of your students to get involved. And it was the biggest uphill battle, to the point where we actually just scrapped that strategy entirely
Wow.
and started going to young people themselves via social media, because the amount of, effort it took to, speak to the right people, and then they would understand the concept and acknowledge the need for it. But as soon as it went kind of up the decision making tree, it just, I don't know, it just kind of fell flat. It just, yeah, it didn't land. And we'd follow up and we'd follow up. And now, the fact that our demographic is hanging out, or most majority of them are hanging out on social media channels, which ironically are also a place that can cause a lot of damage, we decided to just go to them directly. And we've just run a campaign last month where we used a bunch of content creators who have large audiences of young Australians, to kind of champion our message and compete in a bit of a campaign program that we did, and hosted an event as well. And it was really successful because it was really true to the generation, and it made sense to them, and to us. Like, we're a team of young people, and talking to schools got very tiring very quickly, because it just wasn't, we just did not share the same values. And I think there will be a time when it's easier to access students via schools, but for
Yeah.
now, it's still just this generational divide that unfortunately we're not currently strong enough to bridge.
Yeah. Do you reckon something gets lost in translation a bit when your
Yeah.
message meets an institution?
Definitely. And then I think it's also just the subject matter. Like, we know that, the kind of softer positive psychology stuff around resilience and leadership, is and has really been championed over the past 5 years as it's kind of boomed. And rightly so. I mean, there's definitely space for that. But as soon as you kind of go a step further and you get a bit more clinical, and you start discussing, self-harm and suicidal ideation and panic attacks, it's like, whoa, like, we don't have that in our school. We don't have that in our institution. Like, we already have counselors and psychologists who can help young people. And it's like, well, the fact that you're not actually setting up space to talk about the stuff that we know for a fact is already happening in your place where young people are hanging out, because we know the statistics and we've read it in the newspaper. Like, we know for a fact, and it's almost like they're just not really quite ready to go there yet. And it's really quite sad, because it's like, well, how bad do the statistics have to get for our schools to take this on and go, you know what, we're not really scared of any PR issues. And by taking on a program that discusses ways to help your friend prevent self-harm, we're not scared of being labelled as a school who's interested in supporting conversations around that, because we know that it happens, not by nature of our quality of education in our school system, but because of the way that, young people are growing up. It's just how it is. It's nobody's in particular fault. It's just the statistics. It's in black and white. So I think there will be a day, but unfortunately, we're just kind of playing the waiting game.
Some, and no disrespect to any schools, obviously, but like that it's kind of taken a little bit personally. It was like, oh, well, you think we need this because we're not managing this right.
Yeah,
And it's not about that. It's just more
no,
about the fact that it doesn't matter who's working in the school, who the leadership team is, ultimately people are still going to have these issues, right? And
yep,
sometimes I feel like you're right, like having a space for that conversation earlier rather than later, when,
yeah,
everything's already kind of like, and when it's already an issue that's like so difficult to solve. That's
yep.
the problem. I wonder if you'll like role play with me a little bit. Like, say we're good mates, which I'm sure we are after this interview, right?
Mm,
And I come to you and I'm like, I'm really struggling with my anxiety, like more so than usual. I'm finding it really hard to get like to face things. Like I feel like I just can't, like I run away from the issue because it's just so big. What would you say as someone who's maybe done, all kinds of good mate training? Give us a bit of a sneak preview, if you will.
Yeah. So if you came to me and you kind of willingly got really vulnerable and presented that information to me, I would definitely try and take that really seriously, because that obviously takes a lot of, guts to do that, not just to admit to yourself, Emma, but to then, approach someone that you trust enough to get really vulnerable with and go, this is actually getting to the point where I can't actually handle it myself. I need to talk about it to someone. You might not say those words, but in my mind, that's what I might be thinking. And so it's actually never about saying the right thing. And I think that stops a lot of us from, reaching out to people that we care about, or sitting them down, kind of maybe even encouraging them to open up to have these conversations. It's more about showing them that you genuinely care. You care about them in that moment. You have this kind of unconditional positive regard for them, whether they are struggling or they're not struggling. It doesn't make you any less of a human being. It doesn't make you less strong. It doesn't make you weak. And then also having care, or showing that you care about them getting better as well, and kind of committing to, if you are mentally in a place that, you can afford to do that, kind of committing to seeing them get better. And so, potentially after the conversation, where me as the good mate, trying to support you, Emma, I would really just focus on listening and active listening, like not making it about, I went through that when I was, in grade 9, or I have a friend who, did this and they got better doing this. Really just holding that space, for lack of a better term. It sounds a bit cringe, but, really just kind of making that time, and putting your phone down and looking them in the eye and being like, I'm here for you. Like right now I'm here for you, and I'm here for you throughout this process of, feeling more like yourself again. Also, I might not be the right person to help you through this. I touched on that in terms of like, if I'm kind of feeling the same thing, you and I can kind of chat about how, how bad we're feeling, or how bad it's getting, what the symptoms might be like. But I might not personally be in a place to kind of help you get to where you want to be. I might be in the hole myself, and that's okay too. But I think it's important to kind of, I guess, understand whether you, as the good mate, are the right person to talk to. And if you don't feel like you are, go like, say something, along the lines of like, I really want to help you, but like I am in the hole myself right now. Like I'm really struggling. I hear you, but I think for us to both kind of, feel better or feel more like ourselves, I think we both probably need to, seek support from somewhere else. And, we can be, mates through that, and accountability buddies and things like that. But yeah, you might not always be the right person to kind of help your mate out, and that is completely okay. You can kind of find someone else who can. And then in terms of the kind of action phase around like the conversation's kind of wrapping up, I've kind of listened to you kind of list out what you're feeling and what you're worried about. That's when I would probably start encouraging that support seeking. Let's take stock of who is around you. Like, who are your support people? What's your support system look like? What's the best kind of person to approach here? If it's not, maybe a parent or a counsellor at uni, maybe it's your GP, or maybe it's a community elder, or maybe it's an older sibling or a teacher or your guitar instructor, like whoever it is that you kind of feel comfortable, who might have more kind of information, because usually the training is kind of supporting those younger people who, obviously are not trained professionals and cannot act as someone's therapist. Even now at, my age, like I would never try to be someone's therapist, and I would always encourage them to, at some point in time, see a professional. And we usually say that a GP is usually a good place to start, because they can kind of help you down the line of, getting a mental health care plan and seeing a therapist or a telehealth psychologist. But yeah, the goal is always to kind of to support seek and do that professionally if you feel like it's needed. What are you going to do to ensure that you keep in touch with this person? Maybe you just add a little calendar entry to say, reach out to Emma and see how she's doing this week. And then also take time, for yourself. We always say that whether the situation went really well or it went really, really bad, you should still kind of, take a moment for yourself and check in with how you're feeling after the situation. If you've got any kind of lingering thoughts or feelings around the situation that just occurred, normally in more of those kind of heavier topics and issues, maybe it's time for you to speak to someone about what you've experienced in supporting a mate as well. So it sounds like there's a lot of kind of moving parts to this, but it's very intrinsic to who we are as human beings. It's more just about kind of trying to take yourself out of the situation, decentering yourself and going, I'm just going to show up right now and be fully present, fully, show my care in the best way that I can, and then encourage them to not just dismiss the stuff that they're feeling, but to actually kind of take it seriously and do what they can, whether it's looking up ways that they can help manage that stress or talking to a trusted adult or even a professional, but yeah, not just sweeping it under the rug. Thank you so much for watching this video with Student Edge and ALLKND. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe.